everyone, and welcome. Today's webinar, entitled How to Enter and Exit the Downturn with Momentum, couldn't be more timely. Economic uncertainty is top of mind for all of us, and in this session, brought to you by IOP corporate partner Wavestone, we'll be brought through the steps to take to make this downturn and coming out the other end part of your strategy. This program is being recorded and it will be made available for replay. But during this session, please go ahead and get your questions posted to our speakers by using the Q&A feature. If you have additional questions after the fact or would like to get in touch with them directly, their contact information will be available at the end of the session. And now it's my pleasure to introduce your expert. Tom Hintz is a partner at Wavestone, bringing more than 30 years of experience in helping Fortune 1000 organizations drive differentiating value through internal and market-facing services. Todd will be the primary speaker in today's session, and he's joined by two of his esteemed colleagues. Cecilia Edwards has over 25 years of strategic consulting experience with Global 1000 companies, mid-market private equity-backed firms, and nonprofit organizations. As a partner at Wavestone, she focuses on helping clients develop business-centric IT strategies and driving IT-enabled business transformations. She is championing an effort to encourage business leaders to use their resources and social capital to collaborate across stakeholder groups and sectors to drive accelerated societal change at scale. Randy Bean has been an advisor to Fortune 1000 organizations also for more than 3 decades. He is an industry thought leader, author, and speaker in the field of data-driven business leadership. Randy was founder and CEO of New Vantage Partners, a strategic advisory firm which was acquired by Wavestone in 2021, and he currently serves as Innovation Fellow, Data Strategy for Wavestone. It is my sincere opportunity, and thank you so much, to have you all as part of this team today. This is a very important topic that I think will become more important as the year goes on. So please do look to these experts after this session is over for more clarity on this topic. And now, Todd, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Debbie. And thank you to our participants at IOP. Certainly when we came to IOP and Debbie's and others and talked about this topic, it was one that was emerging for us across our clients and was a continual thread of conversations that we were having as we were helping folks kind of navigate the challenges that we have today. Certainly we perceive this audience to be those that are looking to discover and to create a plan on how they're going to effectively manage their way through the current economic uncertainty that we have today. You only have to really look at the daily headlines as a reminder of the uncertainty that as an industry we're having to navigate. And not surprisingly, there's no one single issue that we can address or resolve that's going to ease our burden or remove the obstacles that we've got in front of us. Today's pressures are largely felt as an aftershock of really 2 primary things. The first was the global pandemic that we all went through, both on a professional and personal basis, as well as the regional war in Ukraine. And really, these collective and dynamic events have led to global supply chain disruption, the tightening of talent pools across the globe, and varying monetary management across multiple countries on a global scale. All of these things have led to a certain degree of uncertainty. And we've heard that this uncertainty is translating specifically to you. And you guys are being asked the following questions. What do we do now? Where do we make our investments? How do we position ourselves so that when we eventually move through this with a high degree of momentum, that we are in an advantageous position? We also know, based upon similar recessionary type of periods that we've gone through as a nation and as collective industries, we know that our ability in the pace and speed that we exit is continually accelerating. And as such, it's putting pressures on us as a collective community to quickly respond, to take stock of where we're at and how we want to move forward. And really, that's the genesis behind today's conversation in bringing together Cecilia and Randy to think through how we address and really console others on how to move forward. Before we jump into the overall conversation, we wanted to take one cautionary pause. And that is, we're going to be sharing a point of view based upon a series of interactions with our clients and observations in the industry. And we don't want you to think that this is the answer or this is the approach that Wavestone is currently advocating. What we'll tell you is how you move forward is largely driven by where you're at today. And we want you to think about and take stock of where you're at really along two dimensions. The first is, where are you at from an overall strategic position within the marketplace, right? Are you in a position where you've got advantaged access to the market or resources or talents? And we also want you to think about your relative maturity and position from both an operational and financial resiliency perspective. And once you kind of understand where you're at, it will help inform to a high degree on how you move forward. Now, the direction and the vision that Cecilia and Randy are going to kind of highlight for us, we think is true for most parties, but you really have to take stock of where you're at, because that's going to dictate typically how you'll move forward. To facilitate today's conversation, we created really four prompt questions for us to address. They all fall underneath the guise of how do we exit the current economic environment with advantageous momentum. And I was going to ask and actually pose the first prompt question to Cecilia. I know, Cecilia, you've heard this multiple times, but the key prompting question is, how do we contain cost while investing strategically to foster innovation and growth? All right, it's a tough question, because in today's environment, I think the first reaction of many folks is to contract. And so I'll kind of open up the conversation with you, Cecilia, and see, Randy, if there's follow-on commentary that you may want to provide.
Yeah, so Todd, I think that's right. That the knee-jerk reaction when people think about a recession is coming, the knee-jerk reaction is, let's tighten our belts, right? And historically, people have gone through a process that says we're going to peanut butter some cost-cutting metrics across the organization. So everybody takes a 15% cut or 20% cut. And, you know, you kind of say, well, what's wrong with that idea? And the challenge of that is the investing strategically to foster growth doesn't happen. What happens when you kind of spread these cost-cutting measures evenly across the organization, you tend to have self-fulfilling prophecies around the challenge that's coming. Because you still have customers, you still have demands that they have, you still have competitors that have certain amounts of capability, and you need to keep up with that. And so you need to think through, how do I make cost reductions that are smart and leave my business in a better place? So those are things that help drive efficiency, that helps shift your cost curve, things like that. Investing in, you know, cutting your sales team means you don't have sales. Cutting your customer service and engagement team means you deliver lousy service to your customers and therefore contract more. So there really is this need to think through, let's make sure that we're not doing things that are going to hinder our ability to serve our clients. And the reason that that's important is on the last slide, when you went through that 2x2, if you are in a position where you're in that bottom left-hand quadrant, you're weak, right? You probably have other issues and the recession is just one of them. You need to think about how to survive. If you're concerned about surviving the recession, then most of what we're talking about today isn't really for you, right? Because you need to handle that set of issues. But if you're not in that mode, I actually think about it not so much as focusing on prepping for the recession, but prepping for a strong recovery. right? And so it's how do I think through what do I need to look like on the other side? And what you need to look like on the other side is you need to keep evolving your capabilities, your responsiveness to the market, because you do have this fluctuation in customer demand, competitive actions and things like that. You have to maintain your ability to be responsive there, but you also have to come out with a lower cost structure. Like your overall cost basis needs to be lower, because those people who are smart are going to figure out ways to get rid of the wasted efforts, the duplicate things. They're going to be investing to drive efficiency and productivity and those types of things in the market. So I really think that that's really the focus when you're thinking about these kind of uncertain times.
Right. And Randy, I know that you've been drug into these conversations before in the past. I mean, Cecilia certainly talked about making sure that you avoid the spreading. Is there a perspective that you bring as well as it relates to how we think about balancing off this cost containment while simultaneously potentially making your strategic investments?
Yes. First of all, I'd say I wholeheartedly endorse Cecilia's comments. I think they're right on target. And, you know, there's an old saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. And in my title, you know, my title is Innovation Fellow. So I'm focused on innovation and change and transformation in organizations. And those are typically activities that many organizations think can be accomplished in months, quarters, or a few years. But the reality is transformation activities often unfold over a decade or even longer. So instances like the present time where there's uncertainty in the environment, it really represents an opportunity for organizations to break from the pack and distinguish themselves.
Yeah, and before we go on to the next prompt, Randy, it's one of the things I always think about is you're right, that innovation is a journey, and once you hit upon something, you have to be able to take advantage of it in a short amount of time. And so when I read the prompt question, I kept thinking about, you know, when I think about containing cost versus strategic investments, those one areas from a cost reduction perspective I want to be careful about is those that preserve my growth capacity. Because when I hit upon that innovative stream that does create the differentiation, I don't want to be handicapped by a delivery model that can't fulfill what may be a time-limited differentiation. So I always want to make sure when we're thinking about cost reductions or managing this type of uncertainty, we're always maintaining that muscle to react.
Absolutely. And I'd add that, you know, transformation and innovation, to your point, are long-term commitments and they need to be sustained.
Got it.
Absolutely. So I think I'm taking the next question, right? Or posing the next question here. So, you know, Todd, this is IAOP, right? So we're going to be talking to people who are interested in sourcing strategies, right? And oftentimes, historically, when you were in this, what we tend to call the earlier phase of optimizing models, labor arbitrage were the dominant strategies in the sourcing space. When there were times of contraction, there tend to be a few strategies around just ask the service providers to drop their rates. And if I do that, the service providers come back with sure, we'll drop the rates if you add X number of years onto your contract. And we kind of know nowadays that long-term commitments with volume are not really good for anybody because the world doesn't operate that way. We're in an uncertain time. So what other strategies besides making that trade-off of dollars for duration can we think about to rebalance the overall service delivery models?
Yeah, I mean, Cecilia, it's a great question because you're right. We've got kind of this muscle memory around the what we believe are limited levers that can be pulled, typically around term and rates. There are numerous other things that you can do, and some of which that have really come to the forefront really in the last couple of years. You know, some tried and tested types of approach is to really step back and look at your service delivery model and think about it as an overall portfolio, and potentially re-examine your on and offshore ratios, right? That can be some things that give you some of the cost relief that you're looking for. At the same time, think about efficiency plays. So suppliers are constantly making ongoing investments in the area of AI, in the area of automation. And chances are they have been introducing those to the enterprises on an ongoing basis. And we are seeing accelerated investments on their half. And so one of the things we're encouraging our enterprises to start to think about is how you begin to piggyback off of some of those efforts, perhaps in a more accelerated fashion. And then the last thing that we encourage folks to do, and it's something that I think we all know in the back of our heads, but we don't focus on the discipline of doing so, is to become better partners. And what I mean by this is do a better job of forecasting our demand, create a better sense of predictability and stability in the way that we interact with our suppliers. Some of the ways that we see enterprises think about this, perhaps in the application or the financial services, we talk about dedicated pools of services being predicted on a month-by-month basis. This does a great service to our service providers into helping them maintain a core team on a consistent basis over time. It improves their efficiencies. They get to pass those on in terms of either higher velocity, which helps with Randy's focus on continuing innovation, drive investments, and it can also result into an overall cost perspective for you. So our big advice really around this is step back, think about it as a portfolio, think about the different levers that you can apply, and don't necessarily apply the same levers universally across all of your suppliers. They have different delivery models, right? And you need to recognize that and calibrate it and fine tune them accordingly.
And so, Todd, I want to push in that partner model question a little bit as well, because when you think about the partner perspective, why make all the decisions by yourself? How about you bring the service providers in to help you think through that? Because if you're collectively trying to come up with the solutions, then you give them an opportunity to leverage the full breadth of the capabilities and ideas that they bring to the table as well.
No,
so Randy, did you have a perspective to jump in here?
Yeah, I'd like to pick up on Todd's point about artificial intelligence. So much of my focus is on how organizations can leverage data and artificial intelligence to transform the businesses. And, you know, we conduct a New Vantage Partners, which is now part of Wavestone, has been conducting a survey of Fortune 1000 C executives for 12 years now. And it's interesting what the survey tells us. So, for example, roughly 90% of organizations, Fortune 1000 companies, report that they're continuing to increase their investment in data and analytics. And they've been increasing their investments for the better part of a decade. But when we look at what they report in terms of the progress of the data and analytics aspirations, the findings are fascinating, because we ask, are you competing on data and analytics? And only 40% say yes. Are you managing data as a business asset? Only 39.5% say yes. Have you created a data-driven organization? An abysmal 23.9% say yes. And have you established a data culture? A very minuscule 20.6% say yes. And in reality, these numbers haven't changed in the past 7 or 8 years. So, you know, what it points to is often these transformation efforts are long-term commitments. They're very difficult to achieve. Organizations that back off during tough or uncertain times only fall further behind. So you have to be relentless in your pursuit of your objectives, because it's a long-term battle, and those organizations that stay focused and continue to sustain their investments in innovative areas tend to be the ones that prevail in the long run.
Yeah, you know, Randy, you talked about that long term. Let's think about, we were talking about the pandemic. Let's look at who a company that did extremely well during the pandemic, Domino's, right? And if you think about what happened with Domino's, people often think about them as the pizza company. but they're not. The 10 years prior to the pandemic, they decided to undertake a transformation journey to not just become a pizza company, but to become a global e-commerce organization that happens to sell pizza. And so when the pandemic hit and everybody else was scrambling to figure out, how do I keep my doors open? How do I take orders online or deliver or whatever the models were that they needed to respond to, Domino's just standard operating procedure, right? Because the 10 years beforehand, they were absolutely ready to respond in the way that the globe needed them to when we all were sent home and wanted pizza.
Perfect example.
Yeah, no, I think that is, and Randy, I think Cecilia's example there of Domino's, that was a company that clearly they had that transformation on their mind. That was part of their core mission for years, and I think it's easy to have that aspiration. And Randy, I'm kind of pointing this next question to you: is how do you sustain it? I mean, everyone I think will say innovation, differentiation, we all want that. It doesn't come for free, right? So sustaining it comes at a cost. How do you see other organizations really sustain that in these times of uncertainty?
Yeah, so I'm going to throw some more data at you in an effort to make a point here. And so we spoke about data and analytics and AI. And a decade ago, for most organizations, the chief data officer, chief analytics, chief AI officer didn't exist. As a matter of fact, when in 2012, when we conducted the survey, only 12% of organizations had appointed somebody in that role. But by 2023, this year, when we conducted the survey, 82.6% of organizations now had somebody in the data, AI, and analytics leadership role. However, in spite of that, only 40% of organizations said that the role was well understood, and only 35% of organizations said that the role was successful and well established. So that points out that there's a lot of opportunity for improvement. So one of the biggest things that I'm encouraging organizations and seeing organizations do right now during this period of uncertainty is to take the time to look at their data and analytics investments and make sure that they're demonstrating measurable business value. Because what happens often when I go into organizations, I meet with the data and AI teams and they talk about their capabilities and I say, fantastic, good for you. And I meet with the technology folks and they talk about architecture and engineering and platform. And I say, wow, this sounds great, a nice foundation for the future. Then I meet with the business leaders and they say, we don't trust our data. We're not getting the data that we need in a timely fashion. We're not getting the data we need to make key decisions for the business. So this points to a problem. So what happens is that organizations are making massive levels of investments, but these investments in part are for the long term, and in the short term, they're not showing any type of measurable business outcomes. So one of the things that I'm preaching to a lot of organizations, and it's kind of a grand statement, but there's a point in here. I say, if you as an organization can't show measurable business value from your data and AI investments, you should shut them down immediately. Now, it's not that I believe you should shut these things down, but it is incumbent upon you to begin to articulate and quantify the benefits, even if it's just 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 small examples, because you can't expect an organization to keep investing over and over and over again blindly, just in good faith. And particularly in periods of economic uncertainty, organizations need those proof points.
Yeah, that's a great point, Randy. It's funny. I always think through the discipline that's required to drive innovation in companies, and your data and research certainly underscores that. The other thing I think about, given the period that we're in, is, and I think you or Cecilia said it previously, never waste a good crisis, right? And one of the things that we've seen, there are some organizations that I would say perhaps they historically had lacked that discipline around innovation, but they saw that the current environment was challenging traditional roadblocks. And the examples that we've given is a number of healthcare providers we've been working with. Historically, they would have told you that telemedicine doesn't work, or it only works in very limited use cases. And what we saw throughout the pandemic and now going forward, the adoption rate has exceeded everyone's expectations, right? And now appears to be part of the norm. And so, when you're coaching and counseling folks on this, is there anything that you're asking them to kind of think about on how those roadblocks are being challenged, and maybe innovative streams that have been sitting in the wings? Perhaps now it's time to push these things forward.
Well, you make a very good point, because as an example, during COVID, I was speaking with the chief digital officer of one of our clients' major insurance company, and they pointed out that during COVID, and because of COVID, they accomplished within 1 year what it took them to accomplish in 10 years in terms of their digital transformation, and it was out of necessity. In other words, they had to deliver their services and capabilities and interactions in an online virtual fashion because there was no alternative. So sometimes necessity is the mother of invention. But what happens with a lot of long-term transformation efforts is that organizations get distracted for any number of reasons, including economic uncertainty. And so therefore they pull back on their commitments. And those commitments, when they pull back, it has the effect of essentially taking 1 step forward, but 5 steps backwards, because the really long-term focused competitors are proceeding full steam ahead and putting the pedal to the gas.
Yeah. Good deal.
And I think about some of this in terms of the sustainability. If you think about that crisis that happened, and taking good advantage of COVID, right? You mentioned the telemedicine shift. I have a son who's a senior in college, and it was his freshman year, spring break, when COVID hit. And in 1 week, or educational institutions across the country became e-learning organizations, right? And all of the things that weren't supposed to happen. We bring this to IT service providers. There were rules and goals and objectives of things you could not do from a remote perspective. There were security policies in place that you could not do. There were expectations around consumer behavior that no one ever expected you could overcome. Just hurdle after hurdle after hurdle that we saw falling very, very rapidly during those first few months of COVID. And I think that what the companies that were really taking advantage of this, the people that kind of put something in place temporarily to sort of get through, I think, Todd, that they do have difficulty in sustaining that. The companies that said, you know what, I just now have barriers broken down. So I actually have a more level playing field with digital native players, right? Because all of the barriers that I have are ones that digital natives don't have. And we just eliminated them. So instead of me deciding that let me revert back to the good old days of barriers and limitations, we said, boy, I have a new level playing field. Those folks have no choice. Once you make that shift in your mind, you have no choice but to sustain it, because you have an all new operating model, new problems to solve, new ways of conquering everything, as you think about taking all of that change that in some instances was weeks, months, maybe a year. How do you actually take all of those Band-Aid solutions that you put together, convert them to something that is enterprise grade, robust, scalable, et cetera? There was plenty of work for people to maintain that if they made that mental shift around all of those barriers that dropped during the pandemic.
Yeah, that's a great observation, Cecilia. And the reason I was thankful for that prompt is because I think there are many opportunities that enterprises have examined in the past, and they have either been dismissed, or there were operational or logical or financial reasons they no longer made sense. And now we're seeing people go back and dust those off because of the necessity of the environment. So I think your point is spot on. And I like your son's example. That was an industry that historically had been told that's the way they had to go, and they had no interest in going there until then.
And
My
Todd-
son's school, by the way, coming out of that, so he goes to Morehouse College. They just launched an e-learning degree program, where they're targeting alum from across the globe who might not have graduated, and giving them ways to accelerate and come back and finish their programs based off, in large part, off of the learnings that they had in switching to become an e-institution, and then embracing the metaverse and all of those kinds of things from a technology perspective that enabled them to reach out to thousands more potential students, and then create a new revenue stream for themselves as well.
That's awesome. Randy, I'm sorry, I think I cut you off there.
Oh, no problem. I just want to add one thing. I confess that for most of this year, when people talked about economic uncertainty and potential recessions and layoffs, I was like, ho hum, where's the beef, so to speak. And yes, I understood that the high tech companies were doing massive layoffs, but then they massively overhired during COVID. But something happened a few weeks ago that was, like an alarm bell to me, having lived through 2008. And that was the failure of Silicon Valley Bank, because not only was it, I think, a huge shock to the system in the way that the failures of 2008, 2009 were, but I had a long personal history with Silicon Valley Bank. I knew their management well. They had funded 2 venture-backed startups that I'd done 20 years earlier. When first started New Vantage Partners, we didn't have office space. Silicon Valley Bank let us use their office space for free in exchange for, giving our thought leadership points of view. So it was really a shock to see such a well-managed bank, and a bank that was friends to the venture and startup communities, experience the failure that took place. And what it said in many ways is that these things can happen. They can happen very unexpectedly, on a dime. It looks like the situation for now is more or less under control. Silicon Valley Bank, unlike most banks where have their deposit base highly diversified, their deposit base was largely startup founders, so it was heavily concentrated. But the potential consequences of that were really a wake-up call.
Yeah. No, it's interesting. I was thinking, Randy, as we were talking about this previously, there's a group, when you think about the fintechs, those are groups that are, fully invested in that innovation. And it always reminds me that we've got to be aware to some degree of our own blind spots. As all of us within IAOP, we're stewards of transformation. And it's just a kind of a humble reminder that we may be asked to react very quickly. And so having these game plans and having these question prompts thought out in advance is always good for our organizations. I thought just watching the clock, just leading us now towards I think our final of our pre-prompted questions here, Cecilia.
Yeah, so Todd, again, coming back to our IAOP audience and thinking about our relationships with service providers. Again, one of the knee-jerk reactions is to think through a model that says, what do I outsource? What do I bring in-house? So how do I think about managed services versus in-house staffing models? And I would even expand that into delivery approaches. So what do you think about that?
No, it's interesting, Cecilia. So this is I love this question because it's I have something in motion already. I have something delivering. In at least in my current answer, I'm assuming things are going well from a performance perspective. And one of the opportunities that we think goes untapped a lot of times is to step back and look at the balance of your resources across your delivery models, right? And it's not uncommon for us to see organizations focus their internal resources around new capabilities. Those could be applications, those could be market-facing services. And once they get mature, they should logically re-examine how they begin able to shift those focus responsibilities and those resource responsibilities to a supplier community. So in other words, the application or capability has reached a level of maturity and predictability where automation now can be used, where I can take advantage of predictability and therefore arbitrage. Unfortunately, what tends to happen is we get a group that is focused on the innovation. They get, I'll call it product ownership, and they want to stay with that product throughout its entire life cycle. And we've got applications or products that are very mature. Now they're at the point of being decommissioned, and we look at the resources that enterprises have assigned to them, and they're some of their most senior and talented resources, right? And you think about the IP concentration, you think about the pin-up innovation capabilities that's kind of trapped in those applications. And so we're encouraging folks to step back and say, is it now time to shift that part of the portfolio to the supplier community? That's one of the number one things that we are seeing people do today, and it's helping both with a cost perspective, and it's helping sort of yours and Randy's point of view. You've got to continue to focus on innovation, and so that would be my number one recommendation today on how to rethink your overall portfolio.
Yeah, and Todd, that's really helpful because that's thinking about within an IT context, how do you manage that? But there's a couple other dimensions that organizations need to be thinking about as well. If I'm the IT organization, I need to be thinking about how I delight the business. And if I'm the IT organization, I need to be thinking about how do I support the business in what they're trying to do in the marketplace. So Randy, any thoughts around either one of those two? I was assuming in particular how they support the business in the marketplace kinds of ideas.
Yeah, when you said delight the business, that's exactly right. I mean, I started my career as a COBOL and assembler programmer, so I lived in the IT world, and then I moved into the business side. But, I've become, again, I came from that world, but I've become hugely sympathetic with the business folks, because the business folks need to understand things in business terms. They don't need to hear things like data modernization, data fabrics, all this type of stuff. Not only do they not understand it, it makes them feel stupid, And so if you're trying to build strong business partnerships, you want people to trust you. You want them to feel that you're working hand in hand. So I really encourage, my colleagues on the technology side and on the capability side to work to articulate, to move from the jargon and to articulate things in business terms that the business leaders can feel very comfortable with.
Great. All right, Todd, I think I'm going to throw it back to you.
Yeah, and so so we've covered off on a number of prompts, everything around where should we be focusing, how do we think about rebalancing our efforts. Certainly you've heard from Cecilia and Randy and myself that talks about there are some specific foundational things that you can do. And we've also kind of reminded ourselves that everyone is starting from a different point. With that, I'd like to pause and Debbie kind of bring it back to you. And I believe I see some questions popping up in there, and I was going to see if you were able to curate or cultivate some of those for us to respond to.
Yep, I actually do have a few of them here. Just one second. Get in here. Okay, you've spoken a lot about what to do in the face of economic uncertainty. But what should we not do?
Got it. That's a great question. One of this almost sounds philosophical. And I tell clients, never work in isolation. Cecilia brought up the point. Don't try to solve the problem on your own. Many of these challenges, they're not only cross-functional within your own enterprise, but you can have a great collaborative solution partner through the supplier community. Now remember, when you're approaching this, you've got to think about the alignment of interests between both organizations. But if I were to answer the question, what not to do, don't try to attack this problem alone. either within your own organization or amongst your portfolio partners.
So I'd add one in there. We talked a little bit earlier around don't do the cost cutting kind of evenly across the organization. I think the other piece is don't invest without regard, right? If you happen to be cash flush, to just only throw money at things isn't helpful either, right? When we look at the data from some of the Harvard studies that show who came out of recessions well, right? The people that just cost cut only did the worst. The middle group were the ones that just threw money at everything and only invested. Because what happened was they actually respond to the market really well. And so they come out of that recovery gate really fast. But then they have a cost position that is completely unsustainable. Right. And so their performance starts to peter off. So there needs to be this balance of you've got to think about investing to keep up with market demands and expectations, but you also need to have some of those investments be around driving the cost reduction and efficiency, so that, again, your cost curve is shifted. So investing without addressing the cost curve, you've wasted a portion of that crisis and aren't going to be as successful in the long run.
And what I'd add, and it probably sounds like a Journey song, but don't stop, keep going, pedal to the metal, but do it wisely and stay focused on that target in the distance.
Nice.
Okay, I've got another one. Todd, I'll send this over to you first. How is the current economic environment different from what we've navigated in the past?
So I'm not strictly an economist by training, but what I've been reading and hearing as folks are trying to address this problem, previous recessionary periods that we've been going through have not necessarily been global in nature. So when we were seeing and feeling pressures here within North America, in other parts of the world, the labor market wasn't as tight, right? And so we were able to shift risk potentially across regions, across suppliers that may have foundational service delivery centers in other parts of the world. Access to capital also tended to be more regionally constrained than what we're seeing today. Today's recessionary event is really much, much more global in nature. And I'll echo what Cecilia said again. It requires us now to address these questions collectively, right? So certain parts of the world are able to respond differently and at different paces. And we've got to recognize that and build that into our solutions.
And I'm no economist either, but I would say we just don't know what we're doing right now. Which is very different than previous times. When you have markets that move slowly, business cycles that are very predictable, technology, the pace of change is relatively slow. We kind of knew what the game plan was going to be. We understood what levers, the Fed had and to pull. We understood how investments were going to influence things. We just kind of understood that. Now, I think we're just in a new era. Todd mentioned, what's happening with the labor market. So is this really business cycle related, or is this part of the war? And are we still trying to figure out what the pandemic did to us? Or is it just the crazy pace of change in technology, the fickleness of consumers, trying to respond to those varying demands? I think the level of uncertainty, just in general, forget whether or not we're talking about economic uncertainty, our business environment is riddled with an excessively high level of uncertainty that requires everybody to think about being ready and agile and flexible as the norm. No more of these, you fix it once and you ride out that sustainable competitive advantage for decades. That's kind of gone. The sustainable competitive advantage is the ability to change on a dime, while still maintaining some type of true north, right? Some consistency in terms of where you're trying to head. I think that is one of the biggest drivers of that's different this time.
Mhm.
I would echo that. I would say we live in very uncertain times, maybe some of the most uncertain times in a generation or longer. I'm definitely not an economist. I think I got a C in economics. But for those who haven't seen, yesterday, JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon released their economic outlook. And it's really a fascinating read if you have a chance to look at it. But his bottom line was, he said that, JP Morgan's position was that the current economy is in pretty good shape. There's some areas of concern. There are lingering uncertainties, the ramifications of the war in Ukraine, among others. But we're in an uncertain world.
Hey,
Debbie,
I have one more question, but
Yeah.
you guys are scaring me.
Where do you start using generative AI, ChatGPT?
We're using it. We're using it. Oh, yes, we are. But you didn't hear that from me. I've got one more question. What is the service provider community doing to manage the current market challenges, and how can I leverage it for my organization?
Oh, well, and we kind of touched on that, Debbie, a little bit earlier on. I think these guys were listening to Randy earlier on, or years ago. They definitely saw the advantages of arbitrage were beginning to wane. Goodness, 8 years ago, 9 years ago, and they knew in order to be able to sustain their current value proposition, their market valuations, they were going to have to tap another avenue or channel of value. And so they started really focusing on automation and AI. And I think we might have mentioned that earlier. And so, yeah, I think there is absolutely an opportunity to take advantage of the maturing investments that they've made in those areas. Everything from the automated monitoring to the sentiment evaluation technologies that we're seeing, everything from evaluating customer interactions to product responses to even simple chat features. I believe the maturity of these things have really reached to the point where we can start to take advantage of them in ways that we haven't in the past.
So Debbie, I have nothing to add. I think Todd handled that well.
I just add, I just say make investments wisely, show business value, and there's some good articles out there. Steve Moore, the technology correspondent for the New York Times, wrote a piece February 13. Beyond Silicon Valley, spending in technology is resilient. So I just call your attention to some of those things that are out there.
Okay, wonderful. Todd, do you have anything you'd like to share as a bit of a wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think, is Randy and Cecilia and I, we work with clients on these type of topics periodically, and we ask ourselves, what are some of the key things that we wanted to make sure that the audience kind of took away from these conversations. The first one is quickly take stock of where you're at, right? And so remember that kind of 2 by 2. Am I responding from a position of strength, or is there a fortification type of actions that I need to take place and focus on? And when doing so, I highly encourage folks to preserve their capacity to grow and scale, echoing what Cecilia said around be careful with the peanut butter spreading of those events. I also look to amplify what Randy is sharing with us. You cannot stop investing, right? You cannot stop driving against innovation. If you do, you will not exit this current environment with the momentum that you're looking for. I know Cecilia's done some studies in the past where they profiled the continual trend that the organizations that exit this successfully, there was one thing that they had in common, and that was they continued to invest in the delivery model, in connecting with their clients, in optimizing their services. Taking the turtle or the ostrich strategy is not going to work for anyone. The next thing that we hear is be active, don't be reactive. Actively manage this change. Go back to the concept of I'm going to take advantage of the fact that now we're challenging previous roadblocks. And in our mental model in an industry and within our clients, they're more open to that. So be very proactive in driving and manage that change. And then also, and probably lastly, be active in managing those managed services. They have been making investments. They are looking to weather the storm with you as well. Seek to align the interests between the two organizations, and you will find pockets of value that allow you to exit this much stronger than you were in the past. Now, Debbie, we just threw out a whole bunch of ideas, and also recognizing that, you know, we're clipping the tops of the waves, and nothing that we said can you go and execute tomorrow, right? And so with that, Cecilia always reminds me, you know, in these conversations, we need to have a call to action. And so we are offering up, you know, I guess our availability to our audience here within IAOP, really just to start that conversation. It's just a real quick review of foundationally where I'm at, what are my peers doing to exit with momentum, a review potentially of the constraints, and how to think about moving forward. And so, Debbie, I heard you say that we would be providing our contact information in and around that. And so, as a good steward and a good participant with IOP, I personally have received a lot of great thought and great coaching through IOP, and we want to kind of provide that back for those that may have questions or want to go explore this in further depth. We want to invite that conversation.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much. There we are. Everybody's LinkedIn profile URL is available. Of course, this has been recorded, will be made available to all of our members and out to our database. And please take advantage of the offer. These are experts that you really want to get to know. I'm hoping, I'm just going to throw this out here, that we might have a follow-on to this at some point. You know, that was a few months ago. Here's where we are now. So Todd, I'm just going to leave that with you in case you think that might be a good idea. And Cecilia and Randy, thank you, the three of you, so much for a really amazing program, and hope to see you all back here soon.
Great. Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you.
Good health.